In today's world, faith isn't about easy answers. Faith is about asking hard questions, following your curiosity, making a difference. At the Candler Foundry, we believe in a world in which you can consider new perspectives, find your purpose, reimagine what's possible. When we come together to learn, grow, explore, belong.
Welcome to Publications, a webinar series hosted by the Candler Foundry at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. The Candler Foundry is designed to bring opportunities for rich theological learning beyond the walls of the seminary, making them accessible and engaging for everyone. In that spirit, this webinar series features discussions of newly published academic works and invites the broader public into these important conversations that the books engage. My name is Elizabeth Arnold, also known as EB, and I'm the postdoctoral fellow and New Testament teacher for the Candler Foundry. I have the pleasure of being your Foundry host this afternoon. We're thrilled to have you joining us for today's discussion with Reverend Dr. Lahronda Little, the author of the newly published book, A Womanist Holistic Soteriology, Stitching Fabrics with Fine Threads. Reverend Dr. Lahronda Little is assistant professor in the practice of spirituality and health at Emory's Candler School of Theology, as well as the pastor of Ebenezer United Methodist Church in Conyers, Georgia. Now, while people will sometimes say things like those who can do and those who can't teach, Lahronda Little very much challenges that because she does both and does them beautifully, not only being a very erudite academic, but also a pastor in a local church. And as you will see throughout this webinar, a talented and inspiring author as well. Lahronda, welcome. We're so grateful and glad to have you.
Hello. Thank you, Evie, for your gracious comments and for the opportunity to join in this beautiful discussion. I'll begin and thank you all to who are joining us right now. So.
Yes. Also, real quick, if you have comments or questions throughout this presentation, please feel free to drop those in the chat box and we will answer them as soon as we can and where they fit into the conversation. But first, we invite Dr. Little to tell us a bit about the book, what inspired it, what went into it, what did you learn in the process of putting this together, and just give us a peek behind the curtain.
So in the spirit of my tradition, let us all just take a collective deep breath and exhale. I am Lahronda, daughter of Juanita, granddaughter of Annie Velma and Lucille, great-granddaughter of Sarah Ann, Josephine, and Maddie, the great-great-granddaughter of Molly, and the progeny of a long line of women whose names I do not know, but who no less accompany me on the journey of salvation. I'd like to thank Professor Oduyoye in her absence today, Dr. Hayes, and Dr. Handy for joining me in this discussion. And so, salvation. The issue of salvation came to me from the spiritual practice of meditation while I was in seminary at Candler. The name Yeshua came to mind one evening, and I didn't understand why. Because at that time, I was not involved in a community or a faith community that invoked or used the name Yeshua. I knew the name, but it was not a part of my everyday language. Out of that experience, I went on a journey to better understand that name. From there, my primary question at the time was, why do most Protestant Christians in the United States and beyond use the word or the name Jesus rather than Yeshua? There was something about name changing and language interpretation that bothered me. If my mother named me Lahronda, then why would someone else come along and decide to call me, for example, Rhoda or Ronnie? This line of questioning eventually led me to the issue of salvation, how we understand salvation, how salvation comes, who salvation is for, and why is salvation even necessary? Most significantly, the question of how salvation has been deployed and utilized as a mechanism for colonization was prominent for me. The shift from Yeshua to Jesus conveys not only the translation of a name, but also the shadowing or obscuring of a culture. And I would go so far as to say the erasure of a culture and a people. And perhaps we will say more about that later on in our discussion. But on a more personal note, as a Christian born and raised in the church, I began to question the meaning of my own salvation. And this was deeply unsettling. Everything I thought I knew about salvation was coming apart. And that knowing amounted to a hyper individualized and spiritualized salvation that guaranteed my place in heaven. This particular form of salvation did not challenge me to consider my neighbor in a concrete way, the environment, or the world systems created to control the use of money, politics, education, and yes, even religion. Even after several decades of womanist and Black feminist discourse that began with Doctors Katie Geneva Cannon, Dolores Williams, Jacqueline Grant, and also Mercy Oduyoye and Diana Hayes, many of us still operate as though we are alone, disconnected, disjointed, and our lives do not impact one another. And this instantiates the idea that it's acceptable to overtake and supplant the language and the spiritual practices of others. Therefore, salvation must entail a moral and ethical imperative to facilitate wholeness for everyone in real ways, in the here and now. Colonization, war, the erasure of scholarship and history, and the policing and governing of bodies are not, nor will they ever be, salvific, especially for the victims of these experiences. Furthermore, the environment is also a victim of the hyper-individualized ways in which salvation is employed. So now we are witnessing the profound effects of climate change. A womanist holistic soteriology, stitching fabrics with fine threads, is my attempt to, one, explicate how we got here through a historical development of notions of salvation, beginning with Ma'at, and 2, explore the language of salvation in its context. When we attempt to translate the word salvation from one language to another, something is always lost. And that something has a lot to do with one's identity, one's culture, and the spiritual practices and rituals that undergird and sustain one's connection to the divine. My goal is to make room for salvation, wholeness, and balance in all of its forms, and to make an appeal that salvation is dynamic, ongoing, and contextual as much as it is a way for us to all live as interconnected, interdependent beings in moral and ethical ways. A womanist holistic soteriology is not exclusivist. However, it centers the voices and lived experiences of Black women. My book is for anyone who wants to explore salvation from different perspectives and languages, and who wants to read about how our spiritual practices may inform or shape our academic pursuits. This leads me to mention how meditation and contemplation play a significant role in my writing process. I wrote this book when we were in quarantine and in desperate need of salvation. During that experience, there was this unconscious suspension, a releasing of time that we all were forced to surrender to. That surrendering was a gift to me. That surrendering allowed me to worship with Rise Community Church and Reverend Dr. Maisha Handy every Sunday afternoon. That surrendering, I believe, helped me to have conversations that may not have otherwise occurred. In that regard, this book is a practical theology where I write explicitly about my dreams and the thoughts that flow from my meditations. I hope that readers of a holistic womanist soteriology will walk away challenged to consider how systemic sin and evil impact salvation, and also reflect on how salvation can be unshackled from narrow, exclusive, and essentializing systems of religion and education. More holistically understood, salvation is a means of grace through which all people are being healed and made whole. So now let's talk about it.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Let me just start off by saying your book did exactly, I think, what you hoped it would. At least it did for me. It helped me look at things through a totally new perspective. It helped me see all of the potential and the beautiful possibilities that salvation could be. And all of the ways that I kept thinking of the word salve, this beautiful, like natural healing. And the thought of a salve is something that you touch and you put on your body. And those are the things that you talk about your grandmother having this really physical experience. And those kinds of things are salvific. And so your book was a salve that I just felt put on my body. So thank you so much for that. With us today, we have a few conversation partners that I know y'all are going to so much enjoy. First, we have Dr. Diana Hayes, Professor of Systematic Theology at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And her scholarship plays a very important role in the conversation of Lahronda's book. We also have Reverend Dr. Maisha Handy, the interim president of ITC here in Atlanta, professor of religion and education. And she's also the senior pastor at Rise Community Church, which is one of the sort of beautiful images that we get that is at the end of the book, where we actually see what does this kind of womanist soteriology look like when it's put in practice and it's a lived experience. Our final panelist is Professor Mercy Oduyoye. She is not here yet. We're hoping that she will be. She has founded the Circle of Concerned African Theologians in Ghana in 1987, and the Institute of African Women in Religion and Culture at Trinity Theological Seminary, also in Ghana. So our hope is that she will be here with us today, but if not, she's also a conversation partner in this book. She's one of the 4 sages that Dr. Little introduces us to at the beginning. So thank you so much for being here with us to share your wisdom and your reflections. Dr. Hayes, would you mind starting our conversation off with a question or a comment about something that the book sparked for you?
How about both?
Oh, all right, both.
Question and a comment. First, just a comment. I met Lahronda several years ago. What year was it? Do you remember that I taught?
Yes, it was my first year in coursework, I think. So that would have been 2018.
2018.
Mm-hmm.
I was a guest professor teaching womanist theology and was astounded at the number of students that showed up for that class, I remember. And Lahronda very graciously came in and offered to serve as my TA, which was very, very helpful since I didn't know my way around at all. And after that, I became one of the readers for her dissertation. So I've had the pleasure, you could say, of learning all about this and discussing it with her before the book has been published. But rereading it has really, one thing it has done is given me a hunger to learn more about the African perspective. You do that so well in presenting these African women who are philosophers and theologians, because we don't hear from them. We don't see them as much here in the United States as we should. So one of my questions would be, how did you come in contact with these women and be able to go to Ghana and learn from them?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Dr. Hayes. And little did I know when I reached out to you in 2018 that we would this relationship would
Yes.
have evolved the way it has, and I'm grateful for that. But to answer your question, this whole process has been so organic, and it came about, literally through contemplation and following one step at a time. So the opportunity came up to travel to Ghana while I was still at Candler. Mind you, I had no designs on traveling anywhere when I started my education. Because I thought, I mean, none of this was on my radar. I thought I would get my MDiv and maybe be a chaplain at a hospital because of my interest in spirituality and health. But I went to Ghana the first time to just kind of be in the culture and to learn. And I went back a second time. And that second trip, I was able to interact with West African theologians and scholars. And that just, expanded my world. In between those experiences and in doing my research, I was in the library and I came across this name, Sophie Oluwale. And so I was like, there's a name I haven't heard of. I picked up her book and I was floored and said, she has something to say about what I'm thinking about. I don't know what it is. I didn't know who she was. So I Googled her and found out that she was the first Nigerian woman to earn a PhD in philosophy. So I read all 3 of her books and realized that I loved her scholarship of complementarity. She wasn't interested in throwing anything away, but holding things in tension and in conversation, and also to highlight the fact that African philosophy, African theology, African history are relevant and very present, and are not to be discarded or set
Right.
aside. That these things, this scholarship has deep meaning and purchase for what I'm thinking about where salvation and philosophy are concerned.
Thank you.
Maisha, would you like to offer any kind of a question or comment, a part of the book that just, came alive for you?
Yes, and I'll do both as well. There's so many parts I have to pick
Yes.
one. But thank you first, Reverend Dr. Lahronda, for what I think is really a phenomenal publication. I really enjoyed reading it. Of course, enjoy knowing you. And thank you so much for your inclusion of Rise Community Church as a kind of exemplar of what womanist holistic soteriology looks like in practice. The book also, I think, elicited some sentimentality for me as a Candler grad, remembering my days in church history classes, as a colloquy leader and colloquy coordinator in graduate school. And it'd been a while since I engaged Athanasius and some of the other persons that you posit here. And of course, I appreciate your inclusion of traditional African religions and the philosophy, spirituality of ancient Kemet. I think if I had a kind of opening question, it would be related to grace, right? A very common theme throughout, Christianity, certainly Protestant Christianity, and you talk about Wesley's understanding of grace, and it's hard to separate grace from our understandings of salvation. I've been having some interesting conversations with colleagues about about grace, and so can you say something about grace and why we need it, right? We understand, that from some perspectives we are saved by grace, whatever that means for people. But for me, it's hard to kind of extricate soteriology from ontology. There's something, and you talk about that in the book, right? You start with ontologically what we think about ourselves and how we understand ourselves in relation to God, the Creator, and each other, and then we need grace. And I'm just going to leave it as an open-ended question, right?
Yeah.
For what?
I knew you were going to come at me with that. And we've talked about this before, and I've continued to turn that conversation over in my head. And thank you for mentioning the ontological perspective, because I believe that grace is a way of being. It's not what we need, it's what we have.
I love that.
And in the having of grace, because I understand grace to be ubiquitous. It's something it exists. It's a part of our existence as created beings of God. We have it. Also, in dealing with, interacting with one another, and interacting with creation, we are in need of grace, because how we interact with one another and with the divine is not always the most positive. It's not always in the most ethical ways. And from that standpoint, we are in need of grace. But we always have it. It's a part of our existence. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Can I jump And just one more,
Good.
for one more point here, since we're having a conversation, I love that. And for me, I think it speaks to something that's oppositional as well, related to
Mhm.
salvation, right? Because this kind of holistic understanding of soteriology also suggests that that's something that we just have, right?
Mm.
Just have to recognize it and understand it communally. My doctoral work was around psychological theories on shame, right?
Mm.
Versus guilt. Guilt is behavior oriented. Guilt is what I've done, and it's more easily addressed and discharged than shame, which is related to personhood.
Mm.
But we often apply soteriology to personhood.
Mhm.
Right.
Right. And it's like, well, how do I get saved from being Black? How do I get saved from being a woman? Right. This is who I am. But unfortunately, I think toxic theologies have, merged, who I am and how I show up ethically with my sense of personhood. Right. And so your definition of grace, your understanding of grace is something that we always have access to when we need it for guilt-oriented things, in the true sense of metanoia, and not, just beating up on ourselves, versus, something that we need to change personhood, which again points back to ontology.
Thank you for that. And I think we would do well to understand grace through that lens of having, and not for the use of excusing away or covering our beingness. That's not what grace is for. You're right, Dr. Handy. I don't need grace for being a woman or for being Black.
Right.
I need grace because of how I may have used for example, religion or the Bible in weaponized
Mhm.
kinds of ways. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
You bring up you're speaking obviously as a United Methodist ministry. You're speaking from the Protestant perspective, but I saw a lot of resonance with my understanding from the Catholic perspective. So I want to thank you for that, because it helped me to sort of shore up my understanding as a womanist of how the Catholic Church has hurt so many in so many different ways because of their singular understanding of sin and the need for salvation. There's so much emphasis we put on the sinfulness of a person, original sin, and all of that, and we need to move away from that. And I think your book will help people to see that and to seek a different way. This is one of the things I love about womanist theology, because it is constantly growing and developing, and you've just sort of added another rung to the ladder that we're building that helps womanists, but also helps anyone in the churches, in the Christian churches, to recognize the dissimilarities that exist and how they can work to rebuild our self-understanding and our understanding of our churches into a more grace-filled, as you put it, entity. So I thank you for that as well. I also had a question about one of the things that, as I was reading it, I was saying, now this could go very well here. How has this affected your ministry? Do you use this in your ministry?
That's a great question. The short answer is yes, I do.
Mm-hmm.
I use it in the way in fact we did a whole series on holistic salvation,
Great. Wonderful.
in which I of course use we did a sermon series, and I also did a Bible study specific to spirituality and health. But in the sermon series, I use texts that have been traditionally, interpreted in particular ways, and
Right.
turn the lens a little bit troubling narratives of the creation, troubling Noah's Ark, and troubling
Excellent.
how we interact with God and understand God as the destroyer of all things,
Right.
as opposed to a God of grace. So yes, I do
Good.
employ this text in a very practical way.
Great.
Mhm. I have a question, Dr. Hayes.
Uh-huh.
When you brought, I was having a conversation with a student. I'm teaching Womanist Perspectives of Salvation this
Ah,
semester, and that class, I love that class. It's beautifully diverse with women from all walks of life. But I had a student who is Catholic,
mm-hmm.
and she had a question about grace.
Mm.
And I was surprised by her question, which was, "What is grace?
Mm.
And can you define it in one sentence?"
Oh, oh,
Um, and no, and I did not define it in one sentence because
no,
that's the very thing that I'm pushing against with this
exactly.
text. But my question for you is, how do you understand grace as a
Ah,
Catholic?
oh dear, I haven't thought about that in a long time. Since reading your book, yeah, it has got me thinking about it again. I see grace, and remember, I'm coming from a womanist perspective, so I'm
Okay.
not coming from the traditional Catholic perspective. Um, it's interesting, as I was preparing for this talk by reading your book, I was also reading Pope Francis's new biography called Life.
Okay.
It's a wonderful book, but to me, he is a very good example of what we call grace in action, because unlike previous popes, his insistence is not on individuals, but on the community,
Mm,
that we come together as community. We live as community. We learn as community. We work as community. And we need to be able to see that God comes to us, is already present in us, lives within us, you could say. And that's the grace that God has given
mm,
God's self. Jesus has given God's self to us, not as individuals, but as this community of people who are seeking, how would I put it, seeking the way to go,
mhm,
seeking how to make life better for them, because he's always insisting on looking at the poor, at the homeless, which is the exact opposite in many ways of how we as established church, both Christianity and Protestantism, look at people. You know, the homeless are pushed to the side, the poor
mm,
are pushed to the side, when in actuality, we have to recognize that this is where grace is found.
mm,
We need to learn how to work with, to walk with
mhm,
these people so that we can enhance and better understand the grace that dwells within us. We're
mhm,
very much unaware of that grace in many ways.
mm.
And we so very badly need that grace in so many ways. So I'm not sure if that answers your question fully, but
It does. It
okay.
does. Thank
Mhm,
you.
mhm. Can I jump in?
Yes, ma'am.
Might be taking us in a different direction, but I'm really interested in your perspectives on Afrophobia
Mm-hmm.
as it's experienced across Christianity and, of course, beyond. This is important for me as a being that shows up identified as Afrocentric. That's in the mission statement of Rise Community Church. It's in the
Mhm,
mission statement at the ITC, right? That we are unapologetically African centered in ways that are also evolving, moving from, what Malefi Asante called Afrocentric into
Mm-hmm.
Afrocentric. I love the way you posited Ma'at and ancient Kemetan spirituality as something that can point us toward what a womanist holistic soteriology looks like, right? This notion of balance, order, harmony, and how our ancient ancestors understood that. You also reference, of course, Ifa, right? The Orisha and that understanding of it. I've often felt like a kind of perpetual victim of Afrophobia. But talk about, because it goes back to personhood again for me always, communal personhood, right? And so talk to us about how what you're positing here is a corrective to Afrophobia and to at least centuries in this country of us being, told that we're inferior, and how that got infused into theologies that point back to sin and evil.
Thank you. This is a corrective from a couple of different perspectives. One, the historical arc that I present in the book highlights how Afrocentrism became a problem. But also in that historical, I make no apologies, I make no excuses. I don't even give a defense for what is, because it is. And I find that, I refuse, I did not want this text to be a defense for, but a statement of what simply is. The other thing is we live. I had hoped that this book would be an invitation to interrogate our practices. Many of our practices are Afrocentric and or indigenous. But we go about life, many of us, just doing things, and we don't know why we do them. We don't know where some of these rituals come from. We don't understand, take me to the water to be baptized. We do it, but
Why?
we don't know it. And so this book helps us to lead into, doing that research, and when we do that, we find that, oh, this is not American. This is not relegated to one sector of, religion. This comes from a place.
Right.
And it was not here.
Right.
So what religious systems have done is convinced us that the very thing or the very places that we come from are to be feared. They are demonic. The veneration of ancestral veneration is wrong. When all throughout the biblical text, what do we see? Ancestral veneration.
Exactly.
But somehow it's demonic. Right. The historical art and the invitation to explore our own practices. Yeah. I love that question. And it makes me also think about my my grandparents when we used to help work in the garden. And my grandmother used to ask me, "Do you ever just sit down and be quiet?"
My mother used to say the same thing.
Right, but just and then this wasn't a rebuke to be quiet. It was an invitation to meditate,
Right.
to contemplate, to think about, life as you're shelling peas or as you're digging in the dirt. That's quite, it's natural, it's spiritual. It has indigenous and African roots that we all share. It's not just a Black thing. Everybody has an ancestral history that predates the sin of slavery.
Well, when you think about the fact that as finally has been acknowledged, we all come from Africa. It's no wonder that we find our roots in African understandings, because those were the first understandings about life that we had and about religion. And what we need to do is, like you're doing, go back and explore in more depth what Africans have been thinking and saying and acting and doing for not just centuries, but for millennia, and recognize how that relates to who and how we are today. The problem, of course, is that the whole understanding or the whole way of being of Africa is looked at so negatively, especially under the present political climate, that you can't even say boo about being Black without it being, I don't know, I can't even think of the word to use, but condemned,
Right.
everything. And when I first started teaching at Georgetown in the 80s, that was one of the things I was trying to do, was help my students to understand where they came from and how they were able to link some things were so natural to them. The Hispanics, the Latino students, the Caribbean students, the African American students. And then we began to see, oh, but the Jewish students also had this sort of understanding, the Muslim students, and they began to see the connections between each other that, that we need to keep developing instead of all of these divisions that we're trying to perpetrate. And it all goes back to, at the time, I could only say that they had found the woman in Africa. And finally, they announced they'd found the man as well, of course, right next to the woman. And for me, it just was an affirmation of what I've been teaching for years, that we have to go back. That whole understanding of Sankofa, return to that place from which you came. We all need to go back. If we would explore our roots, we would discover that connectedness. But we're too busy running away from it instead.
What your comment raises for me, the issue of epistemology and our ways of knowing. So the academy will have us to believe that, intellect, reading and writing, certain forms of research are the only ways, are the only legitimate forms.
Right.
And these are qualifiers for rigor. Well, that's one way. Rigor, it's not the only way, and rigor, I even hesitate to even use that word. But I'm going to go back. I'm going to reference my grandmother again. It is not easy to sit still and to allow the thought to come to you and then develop that thought and translate it into something that can be published so that people can read it. That is a particular form of scholarship that should be encouraged.
Right.
I'm appreciating this so much as a person who, has taught classes on hip hop culture, specifically popular culture, and thinking about how what you posit here shows up in those spaces, right? One of the things that I teach, actually the first lecture in my, hip hop origins and religion course is we read an article by Halifo Osamari called Power Moves, the Africanist aesthetic in hip hop. And, we always say, well, hip hop started in the Bronx in New York. Like, okay, but where did the essence, where did the aesthetic of it start? And of course, we know that those who started in New York came from Jamaica. And it's like, okay, well, where did that come from, right? And we trace it all the way back to the West African context.
Yes.
Right? That's where hip hop started, right? Exactly. It started on the African continent and moved with us, of course, through the transatlantic slave trade and to where we are now and into a global kind of culture and reality. And so, when you think about people like Beyonce, you know, and the ways in which what we're talking about right now shows up for her, again, you know, not in the academy, but in song lyrics. Thinking about her song, My Power, in that video where she strongly posits African and African diasporic women. You see the symbols in that video. There's a line in there where she says, you know, don't let me get back to my ways. My power will never take, right? Getting back to my ways is her getting back to African spirituality, African traditions. It shows up in her song Black Parade, of course, and some other things. So, you know, it's exciting to think about how what you're sharing in this book and what you're asserting is actually showing up among millennial Generation Z women.
Right. Evie, you I think we have some questions. I know I've seen you trying to jump in.
Oh,
I wouldn't interrupt this for the world. We do have some questions, but and this actually goes along with what Maisha was just talking about. Is Pearl asked the question, what are some practices or rituals that you have all embraced, like as part of your own personal soteriology, and what changes have you seen in yourself? And Lahronda, you've talked about you know, your grandmother introducing like meditation and contemplation, and I love the part in the book where you open with your dream.
Yes.
And I'll just go ahead and personally confess, God speaks to me in dreams as well.
Yeah.
So to see that in the book, I was like, it is legitimate because Lahronda said so.
Because we're told that it is not legitimate. You can't deal with that, right?
But to tell someone, well, I had a dream about it, and I'm pretty clear that God told me this in my dream. And so to see that in there, I was like, that is a legitimate form because it's mirrored in someone else who is also having these experiences and also following this path and also doing these other educational and pastoral things like that was just so affirming. And so I'm like, so I love that Pearl asked this question, like, you know, in addition to those things, like actually taking your dreams seriously and going internally in order to find that wisdom. How about you, Diana and Maisha? What are some practices, like actual things that you do that help bring all of this together?
One of the things I do, I'm not a meditation person. Maybe I can't keep still. I don't know. But I think instead I pray. Prayer is very important to me. And I find myself, you know, just sitting down and praying. I feel that I pray constantly because anything that comes up that disturbs me or bothers me or that makes me feel good, I thank God or I ask God for help or I petition God. So that's one of the main things. One of the things also that I've done that I realize now has helped me to walk with God is that I keep a personal journal. I've kept this journal since my freshman year in college. And to my shock, that's, I think, almost 50 years now. It is almost more than 50 years. Heavens. But I have discovered in doing that I will sometimes, you know, I will be trying to deal with an issue or, you know, should I do this? Should I do that? Or should I accept this position? Should I write this? And I'll sit there and say, well, you know, why isn't God talking to me? But then I'll go back and look in my journal and realize that I had written the answer already in there. This is how I became a Catholic, because my whole conversion experience, in a sense, began with writing in my journal that I think God wants me to do something, but I don't know what. Over time, I finally realized that I was talking about becoming a Catholic, even while I was trying to figure out what was going on. I had already answered, God had answered my question, but it just took me, I guess I needed the reassurance of seeing it said, yes, I want you to become a Catholic. Yes, I want you to become, you know, because to me, becoming a Catholic was like becoming a Martian, to be quite honest. Nothing about the Catholic Church or anything else. But over the years, seeing how that has turned into basically my life's calling as a theologian, as a teacher, as someone whose faith is deeply ingrained in the Catholic Church, despite all of its issues and problems, because it most certainly is not perfect. No Christian church is perfect. So that's mainly for me, prayer and writing. In this, I'll find myself writing without even looking at what I'm writing, and then later come back and there's my answer right there that I've been trying to get. So I just have to have the courage to go back and look at what I wrote and see what's being said.
Yes, it's the journey, isn't it?
Yes.
I think I'll jump in with some Sankofa myself. You know, as someone who you know, kind of started in a community that was practicing Kwanzaa on the south side of Chicago. Before any introduction to organized religion at all, I was always in this kind of African-centered communities. My mother was a Chicago public school teacher for decades, and you know, connected with these communities, a community of women that started an independent Black school in Hyde Park, which is where my formative education happened, and then becoming Catholic and being part of the Black Catholic community on the south side of Chicago, where I attended, you know, elementary school. And then she married into a Baptist UCC family, Baptist Congregational, and very kind of conservative evangelical soteriology, but very progressive on women in ministry at the same time. Right? So all of this kind of comes full circle for me, and how I showed up in Planting Brides Community Church and in our liturgical practices. You know, one of the first things we say, you may remember, Lahronda, when someone joins our community, we look them in the eye and we say, there is nothing wrong with you. That's the first thing. When they come to join the church, when they come wanting to be baptized, there is nothing wrong with you. You are fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image and in God's likeness. And that's important, particularly for Black parishioners to hear. A lot of whom have church trauma, church hurt, grew up hearing, you know, you were born in sin, shaped in iniquity. You came here with something wrong with you.
Right.
So to reverse that and say, no, there's nothing wrong with you. Right? That doesn't mean we don't step wrong, do wrong, make mistakes. But there's nothing wrong with you inherently. And then, you know, we invite you to be in community that believes that will support you and that will help you on this journey of transformation that we're all a part of. So that it isn't just this kind of one-time conversion thing, but it's a journey of transformation and evolution.
Always being transformed.
Exactly. And doing that through being intentional about African retentions and practices, right? Doing a community libation every Sunday as a part of what we do, calling on the names of ancestors and Yeshua, being intentional about speaking his name as he would have heard it.
As he would have heard it.
Yes.
As he heard it. And understanding that even the word God, which is, you know, German derived, is limited. So speaking multiple and many names for the ultimate reality.
Yeah.
It's important.
Well,
there's I'm sorry, Evie.
It's okay. Go ahead.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to say she basically just answered it.
She did, yeah. And the question from Barry Lee, in light of Dr. Hayes' comment about the need to move away from original sin, how can a womanist soteriology help us do that? And yes, Dr. Handy beautifully pointed to the notion of original goodness, original or essential goodness.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also helpful, I think, in evaluating what is good and what is sin, because I'm thinking about, Lahronda, there was a sentence on on page 95 in your book that just, it was like a punch in the gut, like it hit me so hard. And you write, what was once an inclusive and holistic world now becomes myopic and narrow. This is sinful. Like that criteria of, you want to know what sinful looks like, it's anything getting smaller and getting more narrow and getting more exclusive. And so not only does this womanist soteriology help us to understand this original grace instead of original sin, but it helps us to know what sin actually is and what is good and what is not good. And I think that is a part where people get really confused.
They get confused or grew up in a context in which they never knew.
Exactly.
And so salvation then is to the becoming and the knowing, coming to the realization that, yes, in fact, I am good because God created me like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's another question in the chat from Tom Jackson. And he says, focusing on grace as a thing rather than what is beneficial from our relationship with the divine is limiting. So that would also be that would be sinful, like to see this as a thing, as an object. And he writes, is power for living a good description of grace? So as an energy rather than as an entity. And I'll add my own question to this, is you keep bringing up this ecological part, and it makes me think of grace as like a natural resource, like that we're stewards of, and that like you can take a natural resource and use it for good things, or you can exploit it. And so how does that work in this notion of grace as an energy?
Right. I love how you put that, Evie. And the power for living. And I think the word that's giving me pause is power.
Power. Yes.
Power is not a word. I don't even know that I use it at all in this text. Because power is so easily manipulated and misused. I love the image of grace as a natural resource for us to steward. We are stewards of life. We are co-creators. And from that perspective, power is, we all have the same essential beingness. And so then what do we do with power? I'm not sure.
It's too often been used against us.
Right. And so power for living, power for who's living.
Right. I would say grace for living.
It's right. It's right.
It's grace, not a power as such.
I appreciate the question, Tom. And it's certainly a question for all of us to sit with and to really think about. Dr. Hayes, Dr. Handy, what do you all think?
I just appreciate the use of the word energy as well, because everything is energy.
Right.
And energy, from our current scientific understanding, does not die, right? It always is. It's just present, which is an interesting reflection of I am. That I am energy. I am. I exist always. And at Rise we focus on energy, the energy centers in our body called chakras. Some use the word chakra, that are aligned with certain principles, so that we're always focused. Because a lot of times our theologies are so disembodied. And we've heard womanist critiques about that. Certainly Anthony Penn and other folks have talked about, how Black theologies are, we assert them as if they don't happen in bodies. And so, holistic anything, as you've noted, has to include our bodies.
Exactly.
And we have certain energies in our bodies. There are other, Black Kabbalah and other, African systems that talk about the same thing, I think, in different ways. And so, for me, if soteriology and salvation is going to be holistic, it has to help us answer the question, what's happening in my body?
Yes.
Am I paying attention to my body? Is something off in my body? As a person who's clairsentient, what am I feeling? That's so important. And our ancestors did it in different ways. I'm gonna go back to your grandparents. I had a great aunt, Jessie Lee Johnson, who I shelled peas with on her carport in South Mississippi as a child. So your thumbs hurt. You got this big tub of field peas. And I'm not enjoying myself. I'm doing what I'm told to help her. And she would always say, it's just so relaxing for me. I'm like, how in the
world is that relaxing?
That was her form of meditation.
Yes.
Her energy connected with the things that she grew out of the ground.
Right.
And brought them to nourish family and community. Right. I understand that now, of course.
But not then.
She wouldn't have called it meditation as we understand it now, but she was being a steward of her ecological environment in the same ways that we're called to be stewards of our energy, stewards of our breath, our ruach. It's something that we have constantly. You're right. Yeah. And so we begin with breathing to be intentional stewards of that breath that gives us life. So yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I simply say ditto.
Ashe.
You said it all.
Ashe.
Ashe.
Well, what an amazing place to end our conversation on today. I only wish that we did 2-hour webinars instead of one. But you all have been so gracious with your time. Dr. Handy, Dr. Hayes, Dr. Little, thank you so much. And Lahronda, I can't help myself as a New Testament professor, that the Greek word for grace literally means gift. And so your book has been a manifestation of grace. It has been a gift to all of us who have read it, and I'm sure to our viewers who will read it or who want to
go out and buy it.
Yes. And I also want to invite all of our viewers that if you find this such a compelling topic, that the Candler Foundry also has a podcast called Candler in Conversation. And to celebrate Candler having a new doctoral Doctor of Ministry track in Womanist Theology and Discourse, we have a podcast series where we have interviewed some of our professors that are working in that endeavor. We have one from Reverend Dr. Teresa Fry Brown, one from Musa Dubé. There are more coming. So if you want to learn more about that or delve more into that topic, go to our podcast, Candler in Conversation, and get to hear more conversations like this that will open up your world to new possibilities and new and beautiful ways of thinking.
It's wonderful.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evie, for facilitating this discussion, moderating this discussion. You've been a delight to work with. Thank you, Dr. Handy and Dr. Hayes, for being such beautiful companions in this work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.